Dropping a tray of crystal champagne flutes in the penthouse suite of a Russian crime lord typically ended one way, face down in the Hudson River before the glass stopped ringing. Tonight, it merely meant that Tatum Briggs, or 275 pounds of her, had just introduced herself to the most dangerous man in New York by baptizing his $12,000 suit in Dom Perignon. She weighed more than his safe. She'd been on the job for 6 hours, and somehow, inexplicably, she was still breathing by morning. The Volkov Grand on Fifth Avenue was the kind of hotel that made ordinary people feel like they'd wandered into the wrong movie. 47 floors of black marble and gilded edges, staffed by women who looked carved from ice and men who moved like they'd been choreographed. The banquet servers wore white gloves. The champagne was poured at exactly 41 degrees, and nobody touched the private elevator that went directly to the penthouse. Tatum had worked 2 weeks at the Volkov Grand. She'd gotten the job the way she got most things in her life, by being the last person standing. 14 applicants had interviewed for the banquet server position. 12 had quit after orientation when the floor manager, a skeletal man named Prescott, explained the dress code, the silence policy, and the penalties for dropping anything. One had fainted during the demonstration on proper champagne temperature. Tatum had simply nodded and asked where to park her bus pass. She was 26 years old, originally from a 3-stoplight town outside Akron, Ohio, with a community college associate's degree she'd never used, approximately $400 in her checking account, and a body that no amount of the hotel's regulation black uniform could make look regulation. Her hips were wide. Her arms were soft. Her face was round and open and honest in a way that made tourists ask her for directions and made Manhattan executives look straight through her. She learned a long time ago that invisibility was a survival skill in this city. You stayed quiet. You stayed small, or you tried to anyway. You did your job and you went home. She hadn't anticipated that tonight's private function on the 47th floor would have a guest list that read like an Interpol watch report. Prescott had pulled her aside that afternoon, his thin face drawn tighter than usual. The penthouse event tonight is for a private client. Mr. Moore, Volkov's personal guest. You do not make eye contact. You do not speak unless spoken to. You fill glasses, you disappear, and if anyone asks your name, you say you don't have one. He paused. And Briggs. Try not to knock anything over. That last part was fair. She had, in her brief tenure, already broken 2 wine glasses and 1 decorative vase that turned out to be worth more than her rent. Prescott had docked her pay for the vase. She hadn't argued. She needed this job badly enough to absorb it. What Prescott had not told her, what no one had bothered to mention, was that the private guest was Alexander Sorin. She didn't know the name when she stepped off the service elevator. Her tray balanced with the careful, over-concentrated focus of someone who understood their own liability. She'd Googled the hotel when she got the job and learned the basics. The Volkov Grand was owned by a holding company with roots in St. Petersburg. What she hadn't found, because it wasn't the kind of thing that appeared on the first page of search results, was that Alexander Sorin controlled the largest Russian organized crime network, operating in the northeastern United States. He ran it from a distance, the way powerful men always did, through layers of legitimate business, obedient intermediaries, and the specific quality of silence that surrounds a man everyone is afraid of. He was 41 years old. Silver was just beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been handsome once and had since been refined by something colder and more permanent than age. He sat at the head of the table in the penthouse, a table set for 16, surrounded by men in very good suits who laughed too quickly at whatever he said and watched the door every time it opened. Tatum walked in carrying 14 glasses of champagne. She made it 11 steps before her right heel caught the edge of the hand-stitched Persian rug. Later, she would reflect that the physics of the situation were really not her fault. The rug had a raised border. Her shoes were technically non-slip, but were designed for a narrower foot. The tray was heavy. These were facts. They did not help her in the moment. What happened in the moment was that 275 pounds of forward momentum transferred directly into 14 crystal flutes in one tray, which collectively became a champagne geyser that arced beautifully across the candlelit room and landed, with the precision that only pure catastrophe can produce, squarely on the chest and lap of Alexander Sorin. The room stopped, not paused. Stopped, not paused. Every conversation, every breath, every subtle shift of weight, it all simply ceased, the way sound disappears in the second before something terrible happens. Tatum was on one knee on the rug, both hands braced against the floor, surrounded by broken glass and the very specific shame of a woman who had just destroyed what was probably a $10,000 moment. She looked up. Alexander Sorin was looking down at her. His expression was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for fury. The cold, contained kind, the kind that got people fired, or, given what she was slowly beginning to understand about the room she was in, something worse. Instead, his pale grey eyes held something she couldn't name, something that looked almost like surprise, which seemed strange, because he did not look like a man who was surprised by much. "I am so sorry," Tatum said, her voice coming out louder than she intended, which was also a recurring problem. "I am so sorry. That rug has a lip on it, I think. Not that that's your problem. It's absolutely my problem. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I'll pay for the shirt. I'm going to stop talking now." She did not stop talking. "I once spilled an entire pot of soup on a priest," she continued, scrambling to pick up shards of crystal with shaking hands. "At a funeral, so sadistically, this is not even my worst week." One of the men at the table, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a curb and eyes that had seen things that would make a normal person's hair fall out, reached slowly inside his jacket. "Don't." Sorin's voice was quiet. One word. The man's hand stilled. Tatum looked up again from the floor, clutching a handful of broken crystal. "You're bleeding," Sorin said. She looked at her palm. A thin red line had opened across the heel of her hand where she'd grabbed a shard without thinking. "Oh," she said. Yeah, that happens. Stand up." It wasn't unkind. It wasn't particularly warm either. It was simply a statement of what was going to happen next. Tatum stood up. She was a full head shorter than Sorin when he rose from his chair, which he did slowly, dabbing at his ruined shirt with a cloth napkin, as though he had all the time in the world and none of it was being wasted on irritation. He looked at her face. She made herself hold his gaze because she had decided a long time ago that she was done apologizing for taking up space, even when she was absolutely, unambiguously in the wrong. "What is your name?" he asked. Tatum Briggs." She paused. "Prescott said I wasn't supposed to have a name tonight. But that seemed like a weird policy." Something happened at the corner of Sorin's mouth. It didn't become a smile, but it thought about it. "Go get your hand wrapped," he said, "and then come back." She blinked. I still have a job." "You have a job," he confirmed, and sat back down. Tatum went to get her hand wrapped. In the corridor outside, 2 of Sorin's men were standing by the service elevator, and she heard one of them mutter something in Russian to the other. The second man shrugged and spread his hands in what was clearly a universal gesture. "For I have no idea either." She didn't quit after the champagne incident, which surprised everyone, including Prescott, who had already begun composing her termination paperwork. She kept showing up, every banquet shift, every private dinner on 47, moving through the room with the careful determination of someone who has learned to navigate the world at high alert and hasn't yet decided to stop. It was her competence that baffled them. Tatum Briggs was, underneath the dropped trays and the too loud voice, and the way she occasionally apologized to chairs she bumped into, frighteningly capable. She had a memory like a locked cabinet. She never forgot an order, never mixed up an allergy, never had to write anything down. She caught errors. A double-charged table, a missing bottle from inventory, a discrepancy in the weekly catering invoice that had apparently been running unnoticed for 4 months. She mentioned this last one to Prescott, who stared at her for a long moment and then quietly disappeared into his office. The discrepancy, it turned out, involved a linen supply vendor named Gareth, who had been overbilling the hotel by roughly 8% per quarter. Gareth was no longer the linen vendor by the following Thursday. Tatum hadn't meant to uncover it. She'd just noticed the numbers didn't add up. And numbers that didn't add up bothered her the way a crooked picture bothers certain kinds of people. Physically, in the chest, until she fixed it. Soren found out about the Gareth situation because he found out about everything that happened in his hotel the next time he appeared for a private event. A dinner for 6, quieter and more tense than the first. He arrived to find Tatum already in the room, resetting a place setting she'd apparently decided was 2 millimeters off. She startled when he walked in, knocked the salad fork off the table, caught it with the wrong hand, and placed it back without missing a beat. "You found the billing issue with the linen company," Soren said. "The numbers were wrong," Tatum said simply. "I can't not see it when the numbers are wrong." He studied her for a moment. He had a way of looking at people that felt like a very thorough read of a very dense document. "How much did the discrepancy cost the hotel?" she told him. She'd calculated it to the quarter. He was quiet for a moment. "Ben, sit down. I'm working." "Sit down, Miss Briggs." She sat down. He sat across from her. This man who ran an empire of things she was actively choosing not to think too hard about, and he asked her 3 questions about the invoice. She answered all 3 correctly and then asked him 1 question back about whether the vendor contract had an arbitration clause, because if it did, the recovery options were different. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when she said something unexpected. Not dismissively, not patronizingly, but with genuine recalibration, like a man adjusting the scope on a rifle. "Who taught you that?" he asked. "2 semesters of business law," she said. "And also, I've been in a lot of situations where I had no good options and had to figure out the least bad one." That was the night things shifted. Tatum had been at the Volkov Grand for 7 weeks when she started noticing the details that didn't fit the hotel's official story. Not because she was looking, she specifically was not looking. She had made an executive decision not to look, but because she was very good at noticing things, and the things accumulated. The men who met Soren here didn't eat much. They arrived in groups, always in good coats, always slightly too alert. Conversation stopped when she entered a room and resumed in a different register when she left. There was a room on the 47th floor, down a short corridor off the main suite, that was always locked, and nobody ever mentioned it. A man named Volkov, who came to 3 consecutive dinners and sat at Soren's right hand and laughed too loudly at everything, stopped coming after the 3rd dinner. She didn't ask about Volkov. She knew what she was in. She wasn't stupid. She also knew that the health insurance from this job had paid for her mother's MRI in November, and that she had $1,100 left on her credit card, and that the rent in her apartment building in Astoria had just gone up again. She was staying, and she was keeping her head down, and she was absolutely categorically not developing any feelings whatsoever about Alexander Soren. That last resolution held out for approximately 3 more weeks. It started to crack the evening she overheard him fire a mid-level associate for making a comment, low dismissive, in Russian, about Tatum's size, as she'd left the room after clearing the dessert course. She hadn't understood the words, but she'd understood the tone, the way women always understand that tone, and she'd been halfway to the service elevator when she heard Soren's voice drop to something very quiet and very final, and the associate did not come back after that dinner either. She didn't bring it up. Neither did he. But the next week, a small box from Cathay Gletchik in Brighton Beach appeared on the break room counter with her name on it, a handwritten card that simply said Thursday's delivery was appreciated. Inside were 4 pieces of honey cake and a note that had clearly been written by someone who had never once in their life written a personal note and had approached the task as a logistical problem to be solved. She ate the honey cake over the break room sink and told herself it meant nothing. It was a gloomy Tuesday in late February when the situation stopped being something she could choose not to think about. Soren had been at the hotel for 2 days running, which was unusual. The atmosphere on 47 had the specific pressure of a room before a storm. The men moved differently, quieter and faster at the same time, and the phones were out constantly. Tatum caught fragments. A name, cash-in. A word that appeared in 3 separate conversations. Agreement. The locked room down the corridor had been unlocked and relocked twice in one afternoon. She wasn't supposed to know any of this. She was supposed to be invisible. She was in the service corridor at 6:15 in the evening, carrying a fresh set of linens to the suite anteroom, when the door at the end of the corridor, the one that was supposed to be locked, always locked, swung open, and 2 men she didn't recognize came out, moving fast. They pulled up when they saw her. She was alone in the corridor. The nearest staff exit was 20 feet behind her. "Hey!" she said, with the reflexive friendliness of a woman who'd learned that appearing harmless was a form of armor. "Can I help you find something?" The taller one, broad face, a scar across his chin, looked at the other. A look passed between them that she understood without needing a translation. "Come with us," the scarred one said. She did not come with them willingly. She made that very clear. She also, in the process of making it clear, managed to bring down the entire linen shelf, approximately 60 pounds of folded tablecloths and napkins, on top of the shorter man's head, which bought her approximately 4 seconds and 1 bruised shoulder before they got her arms behind her back. "I have a very loud voice," she warned them. "We know," the scarred one said. "Kashin says to tell Soren the trade is simple." They moved her to a service van in the parking structure below the hotel. She was not graceful about it. She kicked the door frame on the way in, which she was fairly sure she did more damage to herself than to the door frame, and she told both men in considerable detail exactly what she thought of them as people, which they ignored. The drive was about 25 minutes. They took her to a building near the waterfront in Red Hook. Old warehouse bones with new interior work, bare concrete, fluorescent lights, the smell of river water and machine oil. A man she didn't know sat behind a folding table in the center of the space. He was compact and neat, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes because it had no intention of reaching his eyes. "Ms. Briggs," he said, "I'm Cashin. Thank you for coming." "I didn't come," she said flatly. "I was brought. That's a distinction I want on the record." Cashin's non-smile remained fixed. "Soren has something of mine. I have something of his. Or rather, someone. You're going to help me make the trade." "I'm a banquet server," Tatum said. "I have $900 in the bank and a 2009 Kia that doesn't start in cold weather. I am not something anyone should be trading for anything." Soren seems to disagree. Cashin pulled out a phone and dialed. He put it on speaker. The line rang once. When it connected, the silence that preceded Soren's voice was different from any silence she'd heard him make before. It was the silence of a man who had already calculated every variable and was deciding, very calmly, which ones to eliminate. Cashin. His voice was flat as sheet metal. "I have your girl," Cashin said pleasantly. "She's not," Tatum started. "She's fine," Cashin talked over her. "For now. You know what I want. You have 48 hours. A pause. Then Soren said very quietly, "Let me speak to her." Cashin held the phone toward Tatum. "I'm okay," she said, because that was the most useful thing she could think of to communicate. "Don't give him anything. Whatever he wants is not worth it. I am genuinely not a high-value asset. I want that stated clearly for Tatum." Her name and his voice, not her last name, which was what he usually used, but her first name, which he'd only used once before, made her throat close briefly. "I am coming." The line went dead. Cashin put the phone away. He gestured to the scarred man. "Put her somewhere comfortable. We wait." They zip-tied her wrists and sat her in a chair near the far wall. The scarred man stood a few feet away, arms crossed, looking deeply bored. Cashin went to the other end of the warehouse to make calls. Tatum sat with her situation. She was not a woman who waited well. She was also not a small woman, and the chair they'd put her in was a folding chair. The cheap kind, with thin aluminum legs and a plastic seat. She could feel it flexing under her weight every time she shifted. She started shifting, methodically, testing the flex. The zip ties were tight at her wrists, but whoever tied them had looped the binding around the chair arm, which was attached to the chair seat, she shifted again, deliberately with purpose, rated for significantly less than 275 pounds of applied lateral force. She waited until Cashin was at the far end of the warehouse, until the scarred man had turned to check the entrance, and then she threw herself sideways with everything she had. The chair didn't break so much as catastrophically surrender. The aluminum legs buckled outward. The plastic seat cracked through the middle, and Tatum hit the concrete floor hard enough to see stars, gasping as the impact rolled through her shoulder and hip. But the chair arm came apart, and the zip tie slipped free from the wreckage of it. And when the scarred man spun around, she was already on her feet, which was not something he'd expected. He was faster than her. He got between her and the door. He was not, however, faster than the length of aluminum chair leg she'd managed to grab off the floor. She wasn't aiming. She wanted to be clear about that later. She was just swinging, in the panicked, uncoordinated way of a woman who had never been in a fight in her life and was operating entirely on adrenaline. But her clumsiness, which had plagued her for 26 years and destroyed an unknowable quantity of glassware, executed a kind of horrible precision in that moment. The aluminum caught the scarred man exactly across the kneecap. He went down. "I am so sorry," she said automatically, already moving past him. She made it to the main door, a rolling steel affair that was heavier than she anticipated, but not, it turned out, heavier than a woman with a great deal of motivated urgency. She got it open 8 inches, enough to see she was at a loading dock level, facing a concrete ramp, rain falling hard on the waterfront. And then the building exploded, not literally. But the sound of the exterior doors on the other side of the warehouse blowing inward was close enough. She counted at least 4 vehicles. She couldn't see them from where she was, behind the half-open rolling door, but she could hear them. Engines, doors, and then the specific organized chaos of Soren's men, who moved with the efficiency of people who had done this before and had opinions about the most effective way to do it again. She heard Cashin's voice, raised and frightened, which was the first time she'd heard him sound like either of those things. She heard Soren's voice, very close, very cold, cutting through the noise the way a blade cuts through everything else. Then there was a period she would later decline to describe in detail, even to herself. And when it was over, the warehouse was quiet, except for the rain and the sound of a few men from Cashin's operation expressing regret about their career choices. Soren came around the corner of a stack of shipping containers and stopped when he saw her. She was standing in the gap of the rolling door, soaked from the rain that had blown in, holding a piece of aluminum chair leg, with concrete dust in her hair, and a bruise developing along her left cheekbone from where Cashin had, in his moment of losing control of the situation, done something she was not going to discuss. Soren crossed the space between them in 8 steps. He put both hands on her face, tilting it toward the light, and looked at her cheek with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not because she didn't recognize it, but because it looked wrong on a face that had always held itself so still. It looked like something that hurt. "He hit you," Soren said. "Yes, but in his defense, I was being extremely difficult." She paused. "I also broke that man's knee. I didn't mean to. It was the chair leg. Are there legal repercussions I should be thinking about?" Soren made a sound. It was not a laugh exactly, but it was made of the same raw material. Broken open, involuntary, not something he'd planned to make. He pulled her in before she could finish the sentence, his arms wrapping around her with the particular tightness of someone holding something they've decided not to let go of. She went still for a moment, in the way of someone who hadn't expected to be held like that, and needed a second to understand that it was real. Then she pressed her face into his shoulder, and the shaking that had been waiting patiently behind her sternum for the last 3 hours finally had somewhere to go. "I told you not to give him anything," she said, muffled against the Kevlar vest he'd worn over his shirt. "I didn't," Soren said, his chin against the top of her hair. "Good. A beat. Did you destroy all the champagne in the process? Because I'd hate to have come full circle." Tatum. "Yes." "Stop talking." She stopped talking. "For a moment, anyway. Then, are you going to fire me?" He pulled back far enough to look at her face. The particular quality of his expression, not soft, that wasn't the word, but open, which was a word she'd never applied to him before, made something in her chest recalibrate. "I'm going to move you off the banquet floor," he said. "You'll have an office on 47. Better hours, better pay." A pause, and fewer opportunities to redistribute the glassware. She looked at him for a moment. "That sounds like a promotion." "It is a promotion. I broke 14 champagne glasses." "You found a billing discrepancy that saved this hotel $60,000, he said. "And you negotiated your own release before I arrived." He looked at the aluminum chair leg still in her hand, with furniture. She considered this. "I just wanted understood that I still can't walk in heels without a 40% failure rate." "I'll have the rugs replaced," Soren said. He said it the way powerful men say things that are not negotiable, straightforwardly, without theater, as if the rugs were already replaced and all that remained was to inform her of the fact. And then he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her, she realized, for quite some time. Not past her, not through her, not at the version of her that fit some expected shape, but directly at her. The actual her. The one who was damp and bruised and still holding the leg of a folding chair, and he looked at her like she was the most coherent thing in the room. She put the chair leg down. "Okay," she said. "Deal." Back on the 47th floor, things settled into a new shape. The bulletproof glass that had always been there became something Tatum now understood, and the careful habits of Soren's world became things she moved through with increasing fluency rather than baffled collision. She still tripped on the rug. She would probably always trip on the rug. The rug situation was, the facilities manager eventually confided to her in a moment of vulnerability, practically structural at this point. She still spoke too loudly in rooms where everyone else was whispering, still apologized to the furniture, still calculated discrepancies in her head at dinner parties, and interrupted conversations to mention them. But the men on 47 stopped watching her with the cautious bewilderment of people waiting for a disruption and started watching her the way they watched Soren, with the particular attention paid to someone who controls something important. They held the elevator. They put her coffee on before she asked. A man named Debrescu, who had the approximate emotional expressiveness of a parking structure, once left a piece of his wife's homemade pastry on her desk, without explanation or attribution, and they both pretended it hadn't happened. Soren's world was not a safe world. She was not naive about that. But it was, she had come to understand, a world that made its own kind of complete sense. A world governed by loyalty and precision and the specific weight of a person's word, and she had stumbled into it, quite literally, and discovered that she fit inside it, in a way she'd never quite fit anywhere else. Not because she changed herself to fit. She hadn't changed a thing. The world had moved around her, the way the right kind of space does when it finally finds the right kind of person to fill it. Tatum Briggs, £275, $900 in the bank, still occasionally bleeding from contact with broken things she'd meant to handle more carefully. She was no longer just the clumsy girl from the hotel. She was the woman that Alexander Soren had restructured his entire 47th floor around. And on the mornings when she walked through those doors, past the men who stood a little straighter and the rugs that had, finally, been replaced, she understood that some people arrive in a life like a mistake and turn out to have been, all along, exactly the point.